For women, I do think that intellectual humility can be counterproductive in some settings. And I'm actually saying that I think women should be intellectually arrogant to an extent, to have shakara when it comes to knowledge production, if you like. Because, if we are saying that we want a feminist world, we want to smash the patriarchy, and we want to reconstruct a whole new world, that takes some level of arrogance, right? It's not a humble project. So yes, Shakara is very much about being bold, believing in our views, putting them out there, standing up for them, and being unapologetic about that.
All right, I am joined today by Minna Salami. Minna, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am very excited to talk about your excellent new book, Can Feminism Be African? Although I feel like based on how you explore in the book, I feel like I should be asking the question with the different emphases on different words as I go. But I'm gonna let you do that a little bit later. In thinking about how to kick off this conversation, I was thinking about how this book is so clarifying in the nature of clarifying complexity, as you sort of speak about in the book, of taking something in its entirety rather than trying to reduce it with rationality. And I realized maybe the best question to kick us off for this book is to start with, how do you describe it? Because it's such an elusive, kind of fluid exploration. And so it seems like a very hard book to actually kind of like get to a quick pitch. So I'm wondering, maybe to kick us off, how do you describe this book?
I mean, the first thing I want to say to that is that I am aware that it's quite a strange book, and I didn't set out to write such a strange book. I thought it would be more, more sort of clearly structured. It is clearly structured, but I had, I guess, in mind a book that could be easily described. And that is, you're absolutely right, not necessarily the book that I have written. Although it turns out that there is a kind of, maybe like an elevator pitch or something, like how to describe the book in a concise way. And basically, what I am doing in Can Feminism Be African is probing into the political philosophy of African feminism and applying it to issues that we face in the world at large. So African feminist political philosophy, as the phrase implies, is concerned with Africa and with feminism. So meaning it is concerned with the continent, so the people of the continent and the politics of the continent, the philosophy, everything about the continent. And then it is also concerned with women, you could say, primarily, because it is about feminism. And then it is concerned with the world in which African women find ourselves, and how that is shaped, how African women shape the world, and how the world shapes the lived experience of women of African heritage. So in a nutshell, the political philosophy of African feminism is the concern of the book.
Mm. And then I sort of teased this in the first part of that question, but I'd love if we could maybe do some quick bullet points around the associated question. So you have the, can feminism be African? Can feminism be African? Can feminism be African? But then you also have these questions that you initially encounter from other folks that you describe having to not dispatch with, but sort of orient away from, or sort of like address and then orient toward your pursuits. I want to start with these questions because you have this questions and paradox chapter. So talk to me about these questions that you were pursuing, and also the questions that sort of surround that other folks were asking you.
Sure, I'll start with the questions that other folks were asking me. So when I would share that I am writing a book about African, or even with the title, Can Feminism Be African? People would typically ask me, and this is not only the case while I was writing the book, but throughout the long journey that I've been on of like advocating and thinking about African feminism, I always get this question of, what is African feminism? That's sort of the first question that people ask. And it makes sense that people ask this question. It's sort of perfectly okay to be curious about things that we don't know. But there is a sense in which the question is asked that has always disturbed me a little bit, because it implies that African feminism is something, diametrically different to feminism at large. And what that diametrically different thing is typically kind of conveyed by a follow-up question that I get, which is, what kinds of issues is African feminism dealing with? Or people will even very often immediately follow up with saying, yeah, in Africa you have all these issues with FGM, female genital mutilation, or with wars and impoverishment, assuming that African feminism is necessarily only about humanitarian issues. And that also still makes sense, because in a continent where there are many humanitarian issues that are very worrying and tragic, it makes sense, of course, that African feminism would grapple with those issues, and we do, it does, absolutely. But it is curious somehow that, within the context of Africa, that we would reduce feminism to humanitarian issues, when in every other part of the world, and especially in the West, we kind of assume that feminism is a political philosophy, that it is dealing with more than the structural, more than the empirical, and also with philosophy and knowledge production and psychology and all of these other realms of cultural experience. And so one of the things that I immediately knew that I didn't want to do was to sort of write a book about the humanitarian issues that African feminism necessarily also does grapple with. And instead, the question, can feminism be African, is speaking to these problems as I perceive them in the way that people perceive African feminism. And in some sense, I'm asking the question with the word already at the end of the question. So I'm sort of asking, can feminism be African already? Implying that, maybe that is directed at the kind of the feminist movement at large, because in the past decade or so, decade plus, there has been a kind of unprecedented interest in feminist literature. Feminist literature is having a moment. There could certainly be even more books about feminism published, but there are very many compared to previous times. And many of these books have an intersectional lens, so they are looking at feminism through a class, race, and gender perspective to a significant extent. And yet, despite all that, there's a kind of absence of the voices of feminists from Africa, from the continent and from the diaspora. So asking the question with an already at the end is sort of saying, can we include these voices already? And then there's another sense in which the question, can feminism be African, is asked, which is to kind of, which it is a provocative question, and it is intentionally, in this second sense, provoking people who have bought into what I would argue is, possibly one of the biggest backlashes against feminism that the movement has encountered in its history, which is a backlash taking place in the African continent and diaspora, which makes this very bold claim that feminism is un-African. And this claim is so outrageous, and yet it has gotten so much purchase that it's one of the first things that comes to people's minds, whether they agree or disagree with that sentiment, when they hear African feminism. And so the question is, is sort of engaging with that backlash in a sense. And there is maybe some sense in which people who are advocates of the backlash would see the title and go, yeah, exactly, feminism cannot be African, and and then maybe pick up the book. And obviously that's I'm not aligned with this group of people, but and I'm not necessarily writing to connect with that group either per se. They're not my target audience. But I do want to engage with that question because it's still so prominent in the conversations around African feminism. And then the third and last reason that I'll mention for the question, the title question, is because it is such a paradoxical question. And I think that paradoxes are really generative. You know, there's something about when the mind encounters a paradox that keeps us focused in that space. You know, it's like almost like when you hear a koan or an African proverb also has that kind of spirit, or any proverb for that matter, that sometimes there's something riddle-like, and it means that we start to probe more deeply. And paradoxes have that same kind of sentiment. Also, paradoxes, as I show in the book, are actually very much part of feminism's history. Some of the most famous, feminist slogans, like "the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," "Ain't I a woman?" One is not, which I'm not mentioning now, the people who, Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house." Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman?" Simone de Beauvoir said that one is not born, but rather one becomes a woman. And these are all paradoxical statements, and I'm arguing that these kinds of statements have been very generative for moving the feminism forward.
And you also bring up your previous book, Sensuous Knowledge, and sort of situate sensuous knowledge in maybe contradistinction to another term you've coined, Europatriarchy. And I think this is maybe a good moment to kind of not do a compare contrast exercise necessarily, but kind of talk about how those sit with each other in this context of this question.
Yeah, this book, Can Feminism Be African, is in many ways a sequel to Sensuous Knowledge, partly because what I am doing in Can Feminism Be African is, it is sort of doing Sensuous Knowledge. So continuing the project of inventing a new way of knowing, in this book very specifically through conceptualizing and kind of creating a new lexicon and through this new lexicon, a new imaginary with which we can help, with which we can understand and diagnose and then also provide new visions for our world. And that is very much the imperative and the seed that was planted in Sensuous Knowledge. But I'm also I'm exploring many of the themes in this book, and particularly Europatriarchal knowledge, which you just mentioned, which is what I contrasted indeed with Sensuous Knowledge, and it's a coinage that I myself have benefited a lot from, and like just making sense of where we are in the world today. And I've also come to see that a lot of other people have benefited from it. It's sort of become used in various kinds of spaces, and people very often tell me that it's been so useful to them. And so in the 4 years since Sensuous Knowledge was published, I have been developing Europatriarchal knowledge. I sort of realized that there was much more to unpack about it. And so that's something that I also go into at depth in Can Feminism Be African? So it's really all very intermingled still, and probably all of my work will continue along these threads.
Well, there's so many juicy quotes and excerpts to pull, and of course hopefully those are invitations for folks to read the book. But you talk about how Europatriarchy, quote, diminishes deeper human values with its mechanistic and deterministic worldview. It forces things that defy logic or measurement, such as freedom, imagination, justice, and other qualities, into rigid boxes. I so appreciate how you're enacting sensuous knowledge in contradistinction to that way of knowing. And, I, as a reader, experience the ways that Europatriarchal knowledge systems live in me as I'm reading, where I find myself craving answers to the questions that you're provoking and being drawn. It's almost like a narrative where there's this mystery that I keep sort of being drawn along with. And I think that I want to get to the answer, but as I stop in different places, I sort of sit with that sensuous knowledge. And so it gives me not only new content, new knowledge to consider, but also new ways of really getting into that. So I appreciate how you were able to enact that in the book.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's wonderful to hear that the book that you experienced and read the book in that way. I mean, I think that was partly what I was experiencing writing it, because it really was a kind of voyage of discovery for me, and it's also what I wanted to conjure for readers, to sort of make it psychoactive in some sense, the reading, because I mean, sensuous knowledge is something that writing about it is only kind of the tip of the iceberg. I'm trying to get to something that is felt and experienced. But that's what I try to do, nevertheless, to bring that in as much as I possibly could as a kind of process of just entering a new world, in a sense. I mean, that's, and it's not for the sake of it. I didn't, as I say in the book, it's not about entertainment. But there is maybe, it gladdens me to hear that you wanted to keep reading, and it gladdens me to know that it maybe has that sense of like a story where you want to continue, and it's not just your kind of typical maybe nonfiction where you're just getting information. Oops.
Totally.
Let's see.
I'll let you get your earbud back.
Yeah, there we go.
Connected to this, you also have this idea of superiorism, and you describe that logic as to assert difference, rank and vilify the other, justify competitiveness with violence if necessary, defend your actions with a biased interpretation of rationality, and assert control. A lot of people still think of rationality as a pure positive thing. Like if you're approaching the pursuit of knowledge with rationality, then you're still kind of doing it the quote right way. And you're troubling that idea. I'd love to invite you to elaborate.
Absolutely. So what I'm saying is not so much that there is a problem with prioritizing rationality, and certainly not with rationality in itself. I think I even say in the book that there's something sacred about rationality, to me anyway, even if I do say so in jest, because of course rationalists would shy away from a term like sacred. But having said that, I mean, I must confess that I think part of my fixation with unpacking and understanding Euro-patriarchal knowledge and it being such a feature in my writing is because I am very rational. I am somebody who, that sounds like such a weird thing to say. It's almost like a humble brag, or I don't mean it in that way, but I know it from relationships that I have with people around me, that I'm often accused of somehow thinking in a very rational or logical way. And so I say all this to preface that I'm certainly not against rationality. I think rationality is one of the most beautiful qualities of what we can do as humans. But maybe precisely because it is beautiful, that is a word that I want to emphasize, because that's not how we think about it. We think about it in this very functional way because indeed what I refer to as superiorism has weaponized rationality in order to exploit, oppress, reduce our experience of the world into something that is, very quantitative and removing the qualitative side of human experience and interaction with the natural world. And so what I am saying, and what lies at the heart of both Sensuous Knowledge and this book in so many ways, is that it's the kind of synthesis of the two. Is the removal of a hierarchy and a sort of pyramidical paradigm between rationality and any other quality that we have access to as humans in how we construct our world. And really seeing that, even if we advocate and we insist that we are just rational a rational species and that's how we should be. We are not. We do have, there are so many other dimensions to our experiences. There are things that are mystical, and there are things that are emotional, things that are poetic, things that are felt and experienced in ways that rationality just cannot explain.
This is a good moment to talk about how you're working through, in the same way that you work through Africa as both a landmass, a metaphysical concept, you inevitably do some of that work related to Europe because of Europe's relationship to Africa. But you highlight a lot of the, even the like liberal feminist ways of understanding Africa, but certainly the colonial understandings of Africa. You sort of highlight how foolish and weird it is to say pre-colonial Africa, colonial Africa, and post-colonial Africa by sort of paralleling that and saying that would be like understanding pre-colonizer Europe, colonizer Europe, and post-colonizer Europe. Let's start with how you were approaching the subject of Europe in getting into this book.
So there's this focus in Europe-Africa relations, as well as like West or global North, global South, whichever expressions we use. The gaze is sort of always on the other. So Europe or the West is positioned as the self, the neutral, objective feature, and whatever else we're learning about or discussing is the other. And so we break it apart, we break the other apart into understanding its histories, its complexities, its difficulties, whereas, there's almost this sense as though Europe just always was exactly what it is today, Europe or the West. And what that is something that has been constructed to seem as like this very sophisticated, civilized place that was always this way. And as an attempt to sort of reverse the gaze, and also to just understand how we got to this moment that we're in which Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which obviously comes from Europe, is so dominant and is the kind of conventional approach and methodology to institutions. I went on a journey, or I realized that I had to go on a journey of unpacking Europe, of like shining a light on how Europe became Europe. And maybe I should just say, to give your listeners some context, that the book is sectioned into 3 parts that are in the title question. So to answer the question of can feminism be African, I realized that I needed to actually define, and in many ways redefine, what is meant by Africa, what is meant by feminism, and also what is meant by the word be, like by being. And so the book is in these 3 parts of Africa, feminism, and being, which are 3 questions that African feminism engages with. And in the Africa section, I deconstruct and reimagine what we mean by Africa. And I'm saying all this because in so doing was where I realized that I also need to do that to Europe, because otherwise it's actually just the same colonial structure of putting Africa under the magnifying lens and not doing that to Europe. Yeah.
Well, you segued perfectly to where I was hoping we would go next, which is, so you put Europe under this lens, and I'm sure that more of that will come out in the course of the conversation. But then you're also doing this work with Africa. And I think it's also a good moment to sort of say, you're uniquely positioned to do this because you grew up in Lagos, but you have a Finnish mother, and you've lived in London for many years. So you have real firsthand knowledge of both of these places in the landmass and the people sense of the word, but also the kind of metaphysical way that you experience those places. So yeah, let's kind of go into the sort of part of the conversation where you talk about the not only putting Africa under the magnifying glass for this exploration, but the many considerations you had to take while doing that, and the many paradoxes you confronted, and all of that.
Yeah, the very first thing when thinking about Africa that I realized, like, Africa is such a, it's as far as continents go, it has this really almost palpable quality about it. When people hear the word Africa, they think about things that are sort of tangible. They think about the geography, the sort of biophysical nature of Africa, the places there that they may have visited or want to visit. They think about the wildlife and about the humanitarian question. So all of these sort of empirical facts that may come to mind about Africa. There's also this very symbolical dimension to Africa. You see the continent, the outlines of the continent on jewelry or as tattoos or paintings. Like, it just has this dimension that we don't really see with other continents. It's almost like the cross or something. It has that kind of purchase. I was thinking about, in relation to feminism, is that the Africa that feminists are engaging with, that we want to probe into, and yeah, in many ways, of course. I mean, we want to engage with Africa in its entirety, but what I show in the book is that there is another side to Africa, what I call metaphysical Africa, which we're not only like disengaging with to a large extent, but we're also discouraged from engaging with. So the Africa that is, that manifests through language and culture and social imaginaries and narratives, that also plays a huge role in shaping who we are as Africans and the kind of feminist questions that arise in relation to Africa.
So some of those questions, I feel like I can almost just sort of like tag the containing word and kind of see where you take it. Let's talk about Andro-Africanism.
Andro-Africanism, yes. It's so the prefix andro, for people who may not have heard it, means male, and so the concept that we use a lot in feminism is androcentrism, which speaks to the way in which the male is put at the forefront and the female. I'm using the words male and female, very biological, because this is how androcentrism was coined. And so the female is at the periphery. And this kind of androcentrism is very much the case in African society, in relation to Africa, basically. But it has specific features in African contexts. And so that's what I'm referring to by Andro-Africanism. And the specific feature that I'm speaking of is a devastating one. It's really sort of catalytically just so harmful for African women specifically, but I would say even for men of African heritage. And it is that we actually conflate African identity with male identity. So this is what I mean by Andro-Africanism, that in the construction of African identity, specifically since African nations gained independence, which starts to happen in the 1950s, up until today, in the sort of contemporary construction and narrative about African identity, I'm saying that it has been shaped from the thresholds of the masculine experience of Africanness, in a way that, for women of African heritage, when we say that we are African, we imbibe ideas that are actually quite harmful to our sense of agency and autonomy. And so I'm offering Andro-Africanism as a kind of diagnostic, so that we can see that there is a problem in how we shape African identity, and we need to understand it so that we can fight back and create a new way of thinking that is more emancipatory for everyone.
And this dovetails, of course, with communitarianism and individualism, but I realize one thing I haven't asked you to describe that you do so deftly in the book is these subtle but critical differences between dichotomies binaries and dualisms. So if you could maybe give a quick sketch of how those are different in your mind, and then I'd love to talk about how Andro-Africanism intersects with the kind of communitarian imaginary of Africa.
Yeah, so I want to preface my response to this by saying that we are living in times where the destructive methodology and sensibility of Euro-patriarchal knowledge is, it's just no longer feasible for our planet, for us as a species. And we are living in the, in the sort of dreamscape of Euro-patriarchal knowledge. Like all of these problems that we're identifying, calling the meta-crisis or the poly-crisis or whichever expression we may use, are a direct consequence of the Euro-patriarchal paradigm. And one of the what I argue in the book, the sort of master concept of Euro-patriarchy is the dualism. It's an instrument that is used to perpetuate this philosophy, this ontology, and so in order to help readers to really grapple and resist and counter Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which, I'm prefacing with this because I want to say that this is serious work. It doesn't mean that that there isn't like imaginative, playful elements also to rethinking language. There is, and there should be, because, we also have to experience aliveness and joy in the world as we find it. But there is a depth of seriousness to the task of like moving. If we agree that the world as it is right now is unsustainable in the deepest sense of the word unsustainable, like we are on a path to self-annihilation, then we must agree that the task ahead of subverting that is one which is, which has radical consequence. Like it's basically a world that is completely different to the one that we know. And it's a world in which we not only reimagine our structures and our institutions, but precisely our, the metaphysical, the epistemic dimensions and our imaginaries of how we actually, deeply perceive this world. And so getting to grips with dualisms and dualistic thinking is, it's a bit of it sounds so gargantuan when you kind of start off. And so what I wanted to do in this book was to really break it down into, to translate it into something that hopefully explains it in simpler ways. And so a very long preface to answering your question and saying that, we kind of tend to conflate dualisms with dichotomies and binaries. And what I show in the book is that dichotomies are not necessarily harmful in themselves, like there can be, two sort of different things that juxtapose each other. Day and night is an example. They exist, fine. And that binaries are also sort of less problematic insofar that, the person who thinks in binary ways is actually like shooting themselves in the leg, because it's such a reductive way of looking at the world. That person might say, oh, day is bad and night is good, and so they never go out during the day, and that's kind of their loss. And I mean, I'm simplifying because binaries, of course, do also have devastating consequences for people's lives. But the real kind of deeply dangerous and the culprit of the thinking that we struggle so much with moving beyond is the dualism. And the dualism sort of imposes a power dimension to the dichotomy and to the binary. So to stay with the example of day and night, like, it creates institutions that fund the idea that day is better than night, or worse, whichever way I framed it. Funds, uses culture, it uses politics, economics, all, education, every possible means to cement the dualistic spirit into the culture is what Euro-patriarchal knowledge does. And so, I mean, you asked me in the beginning, like, to describe this book in a simple way. Another actual way of describing it would be to say that this is a non-dualist feminist book. It's a book that is, attempting to show a world that emerges when we do away with dualistic thinking.
I love that. So, coming back to the second part of the question, you really poke into the idea of communitarianism in how Africa both self-conceives, but also how a projection is sort of overlaid onto Africa. And there's a worthwhile contrast you bring up relative to individualism, the kind of Euro-patriarchal individualism, and then you have a prescription for a middle way. So I want to invite that into the conversation.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. Thank you. So, this is a perfect follow-up, actually, or it was indeed part of your initial question, fittingly, because one of the dualisms that so much shapes African identity and the very sense of being in relation to Africa, if not the major dualism, is this split between the individual and the community. There is a sense in which this dualistic way of thinking has been imported into the fabric of African identity. And what happens there is that there is this a contention and a bridge is built between these two terms. And what I'm saying in the book is that it's more complex because, again, this is a non-dualistic approach. The individual, or what we sometimes lazily just categorically define as individualism in the West, in African context, is not always, just this kind of harmful feature of society. Like the individual is sometimes a catalyst for real social transformation. We can think about people like Nelson Mandela or Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Frantz Fanon. So many individuals that have been catalysts of change. Simultaneously, communities are not always, these emblems of harmony that they are conjured as. The communities can also be real wells and fountains of conformity and groupthink. And so in this case specifically, communities can also really impart a lot of patriarchal traditional values, masked as communitarian values. And so there's something, I was seeking a different kind of language that transcends this dualism. And one language that I found was in this Jungian notion of individuation. And so Jung argued that individuation is this kind of coming to be of the self, but there's an interesting twist to that individuation process because you cannot really come to be, you cannot be yourself without a deep interaction with your society. So there's it's a reciprocal relationship. What I then show is how individuation, what Jung called individuation, is actually the kind of, it informs the philosophy of, specifically I'm in my book speaking about Yoruba cosmologies, but this is also the case in many other African sort of philosophies and ancient ways of knowing, indigenous thought, basically. And, there's this sense in Yoruba philosophy, for instance, which is my heritage, from a very early age, in fact, even before an infant is born, historically this is, but even still in present-day Yoruba land, in some parts, the parents and the families would sort of consult the spirits, if you like, the priests, the priestesses, the griots, the knowledge people, about this child's destiny, if you like, although destiny is not the perfect word for this. But how to help this infant to become who they are. And this kind of way of thinking is then also imparted from the moment that the infant is born. So through its naming ceremonies, through the kind of deities that it is seen to be affiliated with, and just throughout the path of life, there is a sense that you have a kind of destiny, and that it is important for you to find that. But it is always as a member of a community. So it's not something that you take, it's not a task that is approached in a sort of Western individualistic way in its worst sense.
Thank you for that. Another one of these kind of resonant paradoxical spaces that you get into, and it intersects quite directly with your own kind of growth as a thinker, is this idea of proto-feminism in Africa as compared to making claims about feminism itself having a long history in Africa. So I'd love to invite that into the conversation as well.
Yeah, it's really annoying that actually, that's the word I want to use, how much we conflate feminism in Africa with proto-feminism in Africa. So proto-feminism is examples of women's resistance to patriarchy prior to the inception of the feminist movement. And, we very broadly accept that when we look at Europe and even Asia and other continents, if we look at incidents that happen in the 15th, 16th, 17th century of this kind of anti-patriarchal resistance, there's no sort of questioning that this is proto-feminism, that's what we call it. For some reason, which, particularly that reason is something that I also unpack in the book, but there is this tendency in the context of Africa to conflate proto-feminism with the actual feminist movement. So to say that, these queens who reigned, say, in the 15th or 16th centuries, and who executed power in very impressive ways, against indigenous patriarchies as well as against the foreign patriarchies that were invading the continent, that they were feminists rather than proto-feminists. And the reason that I'm unpacking and deconstructing this is because this is so much part of the backlash in Africa, part of this backlash that is wanting to ultimately say that feminism is not African. Because if we can say that, we always had feminism, even back then we don't need it anymore, and it also creates a lot of confusion around the timelines of the actual African feminist movement, which very much exists. It's a robust space of discussion, of activism, of theorization. It's quite a young space. The first books and events that were explicitly dubbed as feminist in Africa take place in the 1970s. So it's a relatively young movement, but so is the feminist movement at large. Even in the West, the first examples are at the turn of the 20th century. And so, conflating proto-feminism with feminism obscures the actual African feminist movement. And I think this really is, part of the backlash, because then we're not able to, with clarity and focus, build our movement in the way that is fitting for contemporary Africa, because we're constantly sort of looking back into these historical examples.
Right, and you talk about how by trying to assert this long history of feminism, you're effectively robbing yourself of the chance to live in the present and look to the future, and then really imagine into what does African feminism become now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying by any means that we shouldn't look at history. I mean, history plays an immensely important role for African feminism. And there are reasons, very valid reasons, why there has been such an interest in history and in these very strong, matriarchal type figures. And one of those reasons is that the quote unquote white Western feminist movement, painted around the time actually that African feminism was emerging, it painted this god-awful image of African feminism as, only having to do with victims. So back to this, focus on humanitarian issues, and as never having had prominent, strong female figures. And so that's one of, many reasons why looking at history and countering these histories is so important, and also just tiring that that this is work that necessarily needs to be done. But somewhere along the process, the language has become obscured, and I would say even intentionally co-opted. And that is what I'm saying, that we need to have this clarity around our movement. So it's not that we shouldn't look at history, absolutely not. But I do also, emphasize that there's something about having what ensues from having the clarity about the timelines is maybe a deeper probing and engagement with African feminist theory of today, and what kinds of concepts and language and theories that we can make for providing new visions for the future as well.
Mm. And this also gets into the ways that Euro-patriarchal othering is now playing out with the ever buzzy topic of AI, and the ways that even that we're seeing kind of the echoes of this othering.
Yes, totally. And it's one of the things that really demarcates the ways that we think about Africa is precisely the emergence of AI, and how, and again, we think of Africa in such dualistic ways. So Africa is always seen as, first and foremost, as other, and then there's this impulse that whatever new technology, new idea, new political movement, whatever it might be, that when we think of that thing in relation to Africa, there's this either or sentiment. Like, this thing is either it's going to rescue Africa from all of its woes, or it's going to, devastate Africa even more than it already is. And AI is, such a good example of this really frustrating dualistic way of looking at Africa, because that's precisely the narratives that we're seeing right now. It's like AI is sort of the manna from heaven, and on the one side, like Africa is going to solve all of its problems thanks to AI, and then there's this other narrative of how it's just going to be more terrorism, more corruption, more this, more that. And as with all dualisms, it's just incredibly reductive, and it's not, this is not a linguistic or a conceptual problem. That's what I'm arguing throughout the book, and that's the spirit that I hope to convey. That this way of thinking is it produces so many of the both the material and the non-material problems, the causes of actual suffering, and things that really should no longer be happening in the continent in the 21st century. But we cannot escape that as long as we are in this dualistic Euro-patriarchal box.
This is a perfect moment, in my opinion, to bring in the concept that you explore of shakara.
Yes, shakara it's pronounced.
Shakara, sorry.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't know. So shakara is a very popular term in Nigeria. I would bet that every single Nigerian is familiar with it. Also partly, people outside of Nigeria, because the famous Afrobeat legend Fela Kuti, he has a song called Shakara, which I encourage people to listen to if you're interested in understanding more of what I will say in a sort of different device in trying to describe Shakara. So it's in English, it would translate into something like boldness, audacity, insouciance, and even to some extent arrogance. It is a gendered term in some sense, so both women and men can display shakara. But when women do it, it's quite often it has like an erotic power as well that it connotes. And yes, I believe that shakara is a very useful, powerful, and imaginative term for us to engage with as African women, but as society at large. And specifically, I would say actually women at large. And I would hone in even further with this notion of shakara to what I mentioned about arrogance. Because, and in, of course, in relation to my book, to a kind of intellectual arrogance, which is a phrase that I borrowed from the feminist historian Gerda Lerner. She doesn't develop it very much in the book of hers that I read, but it really struck me as connected to shakara and as a wonderful phrase, actually. In our society, we tend to prefer something, the notion of intellectual humility. And I do subscribe to intellectual humility. I think it can actually be a very beautiful feature to convey. But for women, I do think that intellectual humility can be counterproductive in some settings. And I'm actually saying that I think women should be, or certainly feminists, should be intellectually arrogant to an extent, to have shakara when it comes to knowledge production, if you like, because there is, if we are saying that we want a feminist world, we want to smash the patriarchy and we want to reconstruct a whole new world, that takes some level of arrogance, right? It's not a humble project. So yes, shakara is very much about being bold, believing in our views, putting them out there, standing up for them, and being unapologetic about that.
It really activated for me. There's certainly in American activist circles, I can't speak to Europe. There's ongoing conversation about what a radical flank looks like.
What a radical flank.
Radical flank, like the idea, it sort of gained popularity with Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Mm-hmm. But that the argument that he makes in that book is essentially that activism has increasingly over time in the West been confined to an idea of peaceful protest, and that the only time historically in the past, let's call it a couple hundred years, that peaceful protest has worked as well as people believe it does is when there's a radical flank that's undertaking more radical activity such that the power structure then is willing to compromise to the sort of moderate position. And shakara, hopefully saying it correctly now, seems to me to be one element that kind of fits into that way of thinking of like, we need peaceful protest. Like that type of signaling exercise is very important, but we need other things too. We need boldness as well. And in the case of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, that's talking about what, property damage, like what are the dimensions of property damage that might fit into an activist schema. But I also think there's intellectual radical activity that we can be undertaking that I feel like I witness in past historical moments that I feel like I see less of now.
Absolutely. And I don't know fully where I sit actually with the How to Blow Up a Pipeline narrative. And because I do think that maybe we're seeing actually a lot more of that kind of spirit of, taking action in ways that is disruptive, but in these kind of material ways, I would ultimately argue. And I see the value of that, of course. But yes, I hear you, and I agree that there is less of this kind of intellectual disruptiveness in our times and than maybe there was in the past. I mean, we don't know because we didn't live in whatever eras we're thinking of, but it seems that there were ideas that came along that really like revolutionized society. And I don't want to go back to the past. I'm not romanticizing those eras, but I think that there's something that maybe has been lost in not focusing on that, and ultimately this spirit of intellectual arrogance, if people are willing to go with me with this phrasing of it, I think the difference to maybe what we have seen historically is it's not arrogance for the sake of wanting to be positioned as a person who changed the world or to get awards or accolades or be admired. It's necessarily because it's rooted in feminism in this instance. And I would suggest that it should only be rooted in feminism or in progressive movements. Like, we don't want intellectual arrogance with Euro-patriarchal knowledge or something. In fact, maybe that's what it has had all along. So precisely because it is rooted in feminism, it's because we are fighting for a world that is more tender, ultimately, more compassionate, more beautiful, more enlivened, and in some ways enlightened. And conjuring and invoking arrogance in that space matters, and it maybe also makes it easier because it's not about this like hubristic, endeavor to center oneself or one's movement even, but really because this task is so serious, it is so urgent, fittingly to the name of your podcast. But it really is for that reason. And I suggest in the book that maybe this kind of project can be approached incrementally, and we can, because as Black and African women especially, wherever we find ourselves in the world, we have been really discouraged from thinking that we can produce ideas, that we can produce knowledge. I mean, sometimes we are afforded space within these kind of more activist movements, within the arts, or things that are embodied and so on. Even there, of course, we've been excluded to such a large extent. But particularly when it comes to thinking about ideas, intellect, philosophy, meaning-making, metaphysics, we're so discouraged from really putting our work out there, our voices out there, and so doing so is really, I think, reclaiming a space that we have been deprived of for too long.
This brings up something that is, I would say, adjacent to the book. When I was doing research on you and looking through your work, there's this piece covering you in conjunction with a few other folks that is talking about how like you're using Twitter really well. So I went to find you on Twitter, and perhaps you're still on Twitter, but I couldn't find you under your existing username. I want to talk about that because this is a topic that I've seen a lot of counter argument on. I didn't delete my account on Twitter, but I don't use it. I just basically made it a billboard to point other places. In thinking about the ways that we participate in terms of like the dissemination of ideas, some people are arguing, and to a degree persuasively, that actually leftists and feminists should be on a platform like Twitter to counteract the toxicity that's occurring on that platform. I disagree for my own reasons, but I see the wisdom in it as well. So I wanted to kind of like bring that up with you. Like, it seems that you're not on Twitter anymore. I'm assuming if you're not, that you've segued to a different such platform. And so what do you see as the role of platforms like that? And what's your take on whether or not folks of maybe more left-leaning political persuasions, should or should not be on Twitter?
I mean, I'm not very good at doing shoulds or should nots. I think people need to, it's always more complicated than that. And people need to do what feels right for them. For me, I actually left Twitter before Musk bought it. I had, for me, a relatively big following, over 20,000 followers. And so it was, in some sense, saying goodbye to something that I had built and put in a lot of work into and made so many connections that were important to me. But I did it very spontaneously. I didn't actually think about it I didn't ruminate. I just one day thought, no, I've had enough of this space, because at the time it was already, I think it was becoming a space that would be attractive to someone like Elon Musk. And it was just very polarized. There was a negative energy there. And it was also really distracting. I want to do work that has depth. I want to be able to think for myself. I want to, spend hours upon hours doing research and really engaging with the material that then informs my writing. And everything about what was then still Twitter was counterproductive to those desires that I have. And so it just was like I kind of had a bit of an epiphany or something, and I left, and I've never regretted for one day. In fact, I've only, I guess, had more reason to see why I made, for me, the right choice. Insofar as whether it's important that there are left, progressive, feminist, radical voices there, I think the question really is, what are we able to impact? It's not about being somewhere and having a certain amount of follower. Fine, that can have its impact, but it's more about, what is it that one is wanting to say or do? And I do really believe, as I've been emphasizing, I guess, throughout this conversation, that what we are grappling with now is so serious, is so urgent, that it does require, a similarly serious and urgent and deep depth to it in the way that we approach it. If someone is able to do that on X or wherever they are, then great. No, and I really mean that, and I do think that there are people who possibly can. But I think for very many of us, this might be a question that makes us rethink, is this really the place where I can do this nature of work? And if it's not, then maybe, it's time to explore other avenues and, or, find a way of splitting time or something like that. But yeah, for me, it just became really a major distraction, and the quality of my life has kind of improved for leaving that space.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
On the subject of maybe more fulfilling research, another great service your book provides is just an incredible bibliography. So many new books and essays are on my reading list now. So maybe as a teaser of that, I'd love to invite you to share any books or essays that come to mind over the course of your research for this book that you'd call out for folks to spend a little time with.
The first one that I think everyone should read if you're interested in these topics in society at large, is an essay titled "Contemporarity," written by an Eswatini feminist thinker called Patricia McFadden. It's a relatively short essay. I believe that it's open access, and you can find it by Googling it or in the reference list of my book. And it's just so wonderful because not only in the way that it's written, so it's got this combination of societal critique, conceptualization, and personal narrative, which is very much a format that I too employ, and in some ways also have learned from Patricia McFadden, who's one of the founders of African feminism and not proto-feminism. So there's the style of it, but then it also provides a language that speaks to this contemporary moment and brings in the complexities of our times. And she talks a lot about the natural world and living together. She herself is living in exile from, I believe, South Africa, and she moves to this little village in Eswatini. She grows her own food. I mean, she's an eco-feminist to the core, after having been this, high-flying scholar, traveling around the world, doing lectures. So she's just a huge inspiration, and this essay was very much an inspiration for Can Feminism Be African? So that's certainly one that I would want to put forward. Maybe I'll just mention another book by a South African feminist called Phumladine Okola, and it's called Female Fear Factory. And I'm not sure if I actually reference this book in Can Feminism Be African, but if I don't, then I still want to reference it now, because it's, she looks at how female fear is manufactured as though in a factory. And she looks at it globally, so in relation to Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America, in the West. And it's not an uplifting read per se, although there are moments of that in this book, but it really provides, once again, like clarity, insight, and language with which we can combat the female fear factory, in essence.
Amazing. Thank you. We've covered so much, and of course, really, I hope people read the book, because there's no way to replicate that experience. Is there anything we didn't touch on, or things that we started to touch on that you'd like to go a little bit deeper on?
We have covered so much. I have to thank you for this, evidently very close reading of my book. It means so much to me, and it's also made me. This conversation's also made me realize, I think, where you started, which is the real journey and the range of all. It's a kind of ambitious, if I may say so myself, like sweeping text and. So no, I think we've covered so much, and there's so much more in the book, I think. But it's been really great to talk about all these things with you.
Amazing, yeah, and I really appreciate the chance to talk about it with you. I have 3 recurring questions that I like to close every episode with. You've inevitably answered some of probably all of these to a certain extent, so feel free to call that information back in or take it in a different direction. So the first thing is, what's one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I guess after everything that's been said during this conversation, I would say that I think people should pay more attention to paying attention, to attention. And, we really are abysmally distracted from not only our own lives, which is, really tragic, but also from the world at large, the things that are going on around in our environment. And it may seem strange to say that, because we're also living in such politicized times, unprecedentedly so. And so it seems like people are, paying attention to almost, too much politics. Every single issue becomes politicized. But I contend that we are, we're looking at things in very simplistic, again, dualistic, binary ways. So yeah, I really think people should pay more attention to attention itself.
Hear, hear. What is one resource that you use or that you recommend for making better sense of reality? Definitely
reading. I would say that as a writer, but for me, like, reading is, it's like the instrument, in the way that a carpenter, to use a very conventional kind of example, would, needs a hammer and a nail and all of those kinds of tools. I think in order to write, you must read, and even I think a lot of writers these days are not reading enough, but certainly the general public does not seem to be reading enough. But also, I say this also grounded on statistics that show that this is the case, and it's not just anecdotal. And yet, I think reading is the number one route to a better life, because it helps us to expand our world, to understand things better, to not live in a state of confusion or despair. It's definitely not a fix-it-all for these things, but I would say it is the number one tool that we have for that. So yeah, reading.
Amazing. And finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Unfortunately, there are now so many in sort of global history, at least. But I think for me, 9/11 was very disruptive to my sense of reality. I think I was about 20 when it happened, and I was doing a degree in political science, and the world was just, even for me, who has always had this like non-conformist, sort of multi-perspectival approach. Now, when I look back at my life, I can say this. At the time, I maybe wouldn't have articulated it that way. But I had this very, there was a set kind of lexicon that I was being taught and that I saw the world through. And yeah, just that moment when it happened, it was, you just knew that the world would never be the same, and that people would somehow never be the same, and narratives would never be, like everything was going to shift. And it was airy because you didn't know how. I'm sure, previous generations have had similar examples, but for someone who was born in the 70s, that was, for me, the moment where reality was, without any question, going to shift massively.
And just for my curiosity, where in the world were you when it happened?
I was in Sweden.
Wow.
Yeah, but only for another 2 months, because in fact I moved to New York specifically just a few months after 9/11 had happened. So yeah, which was why it was also, I guess, such a shifting moment for me, knowing that I was going to be there where it had happened.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed getting to speak to you. Where can people find you and the book?
Thank you so much too, Jesse. It's been great speaking with you. And the best place to find me right now is on my blog, missafropolitan.com, or on Instagram, where I am my name, Minna Salami _ and you can buy the book. At the moment, it's actually only out in the UK, but people are getting it delivered to various places around the world from what I'm seeing. So you can order it wherever you normally would order your books.
Amazing. Minna, thank you again so much.
Thank you, Jesse.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.